Well, Kieran, Scott Morrison and Josh Frydenberg began to sell their budget months ago by saying the budget was about economic management and national security. There is plenty of national security focus in there, which we'll get to in a minute, but in the past couple of weeks, it's become a cost of living budget. Josh Frydenberg opens himself to the charge the budget's about buying the election and mining the villages for the other side. But at least the government can say they are listening in terms of the cost of living. A stunning $8.7 billion has been set aside for just 6 months for cost of living measures. That's $3 billion to cut petrol excise by 22 cents, or about half from tonight until September, saving customers 22 cents on each litre of petrol. There is also $4.1 billion to increase the lower to middle income tax offset by $420, up from $1,080 to be delivered on July 1, to benefit 10 million Australians. There's another $1.6 billion to hand out $250 payments to 6 million people on pensions and welfare. They'll get it within weeks, the government says, likely about 2 weeks from an election. Seems counterintuitive not to hand over the extra lower to middle income tax offset money before July 1, given elections due May 21 at the latest, but it requires a tax refund that system, so they could not do it earlier. On the petrol tax cut, the budget papers say it will actually reduce inflation by 0.25 percentage point in the June quarter of 2022, before being withdrawn in late 2022 as oil prices are expected to moderate. The government says the average car owner will save $300 over the 6 months on petrol. Prime Minister Scott Morrison and Deputy Prime Minister Barnaby Joyce said about 4 weeks ago there was no point cutting the fuel excise because of price fluctuations. This really appears a last-minute budget adjustment, perhaps after political research.
We've been working on the budget for some time.
Yeah, but when did you decide to do the fuel tax cut?
Well, again, nothing.
About 2 weeks ago?
Nothing is finalised until the books get printed, and they get printed pretty late in the process. But we've been working on a series of measures for cost of living, and of course fuel is a part of that.
Whoever wins the election now has to face the prospect of increasing the petrol price by more than 22 cents in September, with indexation increases missed during that period reinstated. And the budget warns that courtesy of the Ukraine war, floods and global supply chain issues, there'll be significant challenges for inflation this year and the next. The government estimates it will spend $6 billion on responding to the Queensland and New South Wales floods of this year, $2.2 billion for income support, $665 million to business and farmers for repairs. There's also a couple of tax breaks for small businesses. For every $100 a small business spends on training their employees, they'll get a $120 tax deduction. Every $100 small businesses spend on digital technologies will see them get a $120 tax deduction. This measure's worth $1 billion over the next year. There's certainly a big focus on national security and defence. The government boasts of a $575 billion spend on defence over the next decade, including $270 billion for defence capability. This includes $38 billion, we've heard, to boost the defence workforce by a third by 2040. The big new thing in the budget in that area is a promise of $10 billion for a cyber centre and for cyber intelligence. Deficits are smaller than forecast, but there is no back in black in sight after what the government says was $314 billion in assistance provided during the pandemic. So we've come from a $134 billion deficit in 2021 down to $79.8 billion, $20 billion less than forecast in my EFO. The headline number for this budget, $78 billion, then down gradually. The closest we can get to that old Frydenberg term, back in black, is a $43.1 billion deficit in 2025-26. And net debt hits 33.1% of our GDP, lower than forecast at $864 billion in 25-26. There appears little doubt the reduced deficits owe a lot to commodity prices. The budget estimates that if iron ore and coal remain at their current prices for just another 6 months, it will be worth $30 billion over 3 years to the government's bottom line. And on the subject of COVID, the budget says a further Omicron wave is assumed to occur over winter 2022, which may again see elevated rates of absenteeism and pressure on supply chains. It is assumed public health measures such as physical distancing and density restrictions are phased down, but reimposed in a targeted way in response to future COVID-19 outbreaks. Budget goes on to say these are not expected to materially affect the economic forecasts. Now, you heard Josh Frydenberg there end his budget speech by saying 3 years ago in his 2019 pre-election budget, he had promised the Australian people a stronger economy, more people in work, and taxes would be lower. We delivered, he said, including an estimate of 3.75% unemployment next year contained in the budget. Frydenberg effectively asks for a reward for the government's work. That's what their pitch is, the government. Reward, experience. They're calling it a choice, whether to have Scott Morrison or what they say is a less experienced and untested Anthony Albanese as Prime Minister, which leaves just one question. When will the Prime Minister go to Yarralumla to call the election? Will it be this weekend or next Wednesday or Thursday? I'm tipping a 6-week campaign, Kieran, as he tries to pull down the opposition leader.
Andrew Clennell, thank you.